Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our J stream. We'll wait just a little bit longer for all the participants to come in the room. See the numbers tick up at the bottom. For those of you just joining us, welcome. We'll go ahead and get started in just a second. All right, good afternoon. I am Dr. Christine Beresniova, the Director of Education and Public Engagement at J Street. We are here today for a very special J stream, Uniting Against White Supremacy, to talk about action and conviction. In 2017, anti-Semitic hate crimes and incidents in the United States surged 60%, according to the ADL. In 2018, anti-Semitism rose worldwide 13%, according to the Cantor Center, including the deadliest attack ever against Jews on US soil, the Pittsburgh attack, which happened 2 years ago today. And we continue as a country to struggle with an administration that will not openly disavow hate groups without being made to. But J Street is all about action. And there is action being taken by ordinary individuals, groups, and organizations to fight this prejudice and hate. And there are opportunities for unity between organizations and groups in this fight. So today we speak with Amy Spitalnick, the Executive Director of Integrity First for America. Amy is also a former J Streeter as J Street's first ever press secretary. She has also worked in numerous illustrious positions, including as the communications director and senior policy advisor to the New York Attorney General. Moderating our call today will be Rabbi Rachel Grant Meyer from HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. She is a graduate of Columbia University and received rabbinic ordination from Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion in New York. At HIAS, Rabbi Meyer develops resources that educate American Jews about refugee issues. She was previously the assistant rabbi at Congregation Rodef Shalom in New York City and has published in numerous outlets and in various publications. Our call will begin today with remarks by Rabbi Meyer, and then we will move into a conversation between Amy and the rabbi for about 35 minutes. And the remaining 10 to 15 minutes will include audience Q&A. So please feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to input your questions throughout the call, and they will be asked of the speakers at the end of the call. So welcome again, and to begin our reflection about today, I would like to introduce Rabbi Rachel Grant Meyer.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to my partners at J Street and Integrity First for America for having me today. I'm really excited to moderate what I think will be a really excellent conversation today and to learn from Amy. Before we get into the real heart of our call, though, I wanted to reflect on this day. This 2 years since the attack in Pittsburgh. Today, I think really feels like an important day to think about the lethal consequences of hatred and perhaps most importantly, what we can do about it. Today, we're marking 2 years since that horrific attack at the Tree of Life Synagogue building in Pittsburgh, which was home to the Tree of Life Or L'Simcha congregation, Congregation Dor Hadash, and New Light congregation. And today, my mind is really set on action. But that was not the case 2 years ago. 2 years ago, in the week that followed this brutal attack in Pittsburgh, I really struggled to find words to express the depth of my sorrow, and it still feels hard. At the time, in the wake of just such utter devastation to the Jewish community, I kept coming back to the words we read in Torah just after Aaron's sons die, Vayidom Aharon, and Aaron was silent. When we experience unimaginable pain and loss, sometimes I think even for a people of the book, as the Jewish people are referred to, and for me as a rabbi, there are still just no words left to say. We're silent. On this day 2 years ago, we lost 11 beautiful souls, 11 entire worlds, as Judaism teaches, who went to synagogue for Shabbat worship and never came home. There are 11 families who now live forever with a hole the size of a human being in their hearts. And whether we knew them or not, whether we knew someone who loved them or not, their loss was our loss because they're part of the Jewish community and because they're human beings. For me personally, though, and I'm sure probably for many of you, there was an added level of devastation that came from knowing that the shooter had knowledge of and actually tweeted about the congregations that participated in HIAS's refugee Shabbat the week before the attack. What should have been only a clear, powerful, and beautiful expression of our community's commitment to those whose lives are in danger because of who they are, and to ensuring that the United States continues its long history of welcome, instead got co-opted as part of a hateful act. And so, like Aaron, I initially found myself just silent in the face of this horror. I sat low, I mourned, I leaned into grief, leaned into community. And this is exactly what Judaism teaches us to do when we've experienced the devastation of human loss. But Judaism also teaches us that after we've given our hearts over to grief, we have to rise up from our mourning and return to life, because it's when we return to life that we honor the memories of those whom we've lost. And indeed, within weeks of the attack 2 years ago, my inbox was filled with inquiries from lay leaders and clergy all around the United States and even further, asking when the next refugee Shabbat would take place. I have to be honest with you that I was shocked. Instead of shrinking back in fear and reevaluating how public to be in their support for refugees and asylum seekers, as would have been totally understandable, in the midst of the trauma of that moment, the American Jewish movement for refugees and asylum seekers didn't sit low. They doubled down. We doubled down on our commitment to welcome. HIAS's local partner, the Jewish Family and Community Services of Pittsburgh, together with the broader organized Jewish community in the United States and the Pittsburgh community as a whole, just jumped into action and provided immediate services to a community that was reeling from the trauma and grief of that moment. And at the same time, continued to provide direct services to their clients, the people at the center of this, refugees and asylum seekers who'd come to the United States in search of safety. 1 year later, a second refugee Shabbat was just as robust as the first. And in fact, Congregation Dor Hadash put out a call throughout Pittsburgh for local communities to continue taking part in this important public display of support for refugees and asylum seekers. And congregations around the United States, Canada, Europe, really all over the world, found ways to dedicate sacred time to bringing attention to the global refugee crisis. We did not stay quiet in the face of hate. Over these last 2 years together, we have risen up with an even stronger commitment to fulfilling the Jewish obligation to welcome, love, and protect the stranger with compassion in our hearts that cannot be rooted out by baseless hatred. We have risen up together to ensure that the names of those who died, Joyce and Richard and Rose, Jerry and Cecil and David, Bernice and Sylvan and Daniel and Melvin and Irving, that their names are a blessing, of course, because of who they were in life, and also because of the commitment that we have made to ensuring that their names be a blessing as we continue to lift ourselves out of our silence and into a roar for dignity, a roar for welcome, a roar for justice, and a roar for a world made whole through our love, our commitment to one another, and our refusal to let hatred and bigotry win. And so today, finally, 2 years later, my mind is really fixed on action. Sadly, the attack in Pittsburgh was not an isolated incident, as we know, whether it's in Charleston, Pittsburgh, New Zealand, Sri Lanka, Poway, or as we're going to talk a lot more about today, Charlottesville. We have seen the devastating consequences of hateful words turning into deadly actions. Even more sadly, this continues a long history of anti-Semitic hatred being weaponized against Jews. And it is also not the first time, particularly here in the United States where I am, where we have seen the connection between anti-immigrant hatred and anti-Semitism. In fact, so many of the restrictionist immigration laws that we have today in the United States were born out of fear of Jewish immigrants in the 20th century. And yet, for every hateful act and hateful deed, both historically and contemporarily, there have been thousands of brave and bold words spoken and actions taken to counter them. And in fact, Amy Spitalnick is one of the people fighting back against the weaponization of white supremacy and white nationalism. And so I think it is really fitting that today J Street, Integrity First for America, HIAS, and all of you have come together to learn more about the context for and connection between anti-Semitic, anti-immigrant, and racist violence, and to reflect on how we move into action. To provide just a little bit more content for our call today, we're going to get started with a short video about the court case that Integrity First for America is spearheading against the white supremacist organizers of the rally in Charlottesville 3 years ago that led to not only physical and moral injury, but sadly to death. So Amy, did you have some words of explanation you wanted to offer before the video?
Well, thank you so much, Rachel and J Street. It's just a thrill to be back with J Street. And so many people that I see in the participant box who I know from my time here years ago. Before we play the video, I do want to caution folks to be aware that there are some sensitive images and sounds in the video given the nature of the topic. So we like to include that warning before we show the video. But I think it's going to get played from the back end now, and then we'll jump into our conversation.
Terror in Charlottesville.
Stark displays of racism.
Trying to promote a car has rammed into a crowd.
Victims thrown in the air.
Deadly act of domestic terror.
One woman dead, others chasing windows.
10 of the people who were injured in Charlottesville, including 3 of the people who were hit by that car and survived, have now brought a lawsuit against not only the murderer who drove his vehicle into the crowd, but also the leaders of all of the white nationalist groups that organized and promoted the Charlottesville event.
We are Integrity First for America. We are here to disrupt the extremism, to interrupt the cycle, to dismantle and bankrupt these hate groups and their leaders, to put them out of business, and most importantly, to stop the violence. Integrity First for America is leading the fight against white supremacy. Our Charlottesville lawsuit is the only current legal effort taking on the broad leadership of this movement, holding white supremacists accountable for their premeditated violence. We know that it's working. They're already facing huge financial and legal consequences. But we also know what we're up against. Bankrupting Nazis isn't cheap. These groups are still recruiting, weaponizing fear, and preparing for their next attack. Now more than ever, we are reminded of our obligation to dismantle the systems of white supremacy that poison this country. Turn your outrage into action, because hate has no place here.
So I think that's really helpful context for our conversation today, why we're gathered to learn a little bit more about what Integrity First for America is doing and kind of the context for how we got to this moment and what we're seeing happen to try to make sense of this political moment. I, of course, am a rabbi and a community organizer, though. And so before we really dive into the sort of policy advocacy aspect of this call, I wanted to just take a moment for everybody to get to know you a little bit, Amy. Your story is so inspiring. So I'm wondering if you can share a little bit of your story with us. How did you end up at Integrity First for America? I know that you were working with the New York Attorney General for a while as a director of communications and a senior policy advisor. So how did you go from there to Integrity First for America? Maybe tell us a little bit about your Jewish journey into this moment, how your family's history and your values kind of inform how you came to this work.
Thank you so much. And again, it's just so wonderful to be back with the J Street community, particularly on a day like today, where a community that has been so meaningful to me, both in my professional and personal life, is a community that I get to spend some time with on this particularly tragic and important day. So, for me, so much of my background, probably like you and everyone who's on this call, is shaped by my Jewish identity and by my family history. I think in so many ways, my family's history felt like this amorphous piece of our past for a long time. I'm the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, and it was this thing that my grandparents would tell us about. In some cases, they also didn't like talking about it that much, probably like many other people's parents and grandparents. It was something that we learned about in school. I brought my grandmother in for Cultural Diversity Day, whatever that now means, to talk about her experience as someone who survived the Holocaust and came to America in hope of a better life for her family. But it was always this sort of amorphous thing in the background rather than something that could really happen again, or that any of the themes that are part of her experience could happen again and again in our history. And so when Charlottesville happened, which was a little over 3 years ago, I remember so vividly watching the events unfold. First, the tiki torch violence on that Friday night, seeing those images. They chose tiki torches specifically to be evocative of the Nazis and the KKK. And then, of course, the next day, which was a day of violence, but it ultimately culminated in the car attack, which is what captured the nation's attention and really made clear just how heinous this and violent this weekend was. I remember being with my family. We were celebrating my sister's bridal shower, surrounded by photos that we had put up with my grandparents and others, and thinking how crazy it was that in 2017 in America, Nazis were so emboldened to march on our streets, kill a woman in an American city, chant things like Jews will not replace us in blood and soil, and feel like they could do so with their faces and names out there for the world to see, which I think is so important. In some ways, it's so different than some of the historical incidences of white supremacy where the KKK wore hoods. The fact is that these extremists today are so emboldened that they can do so with their faces and names out for the world to see. And so all of that's to say, when a few months later, I got a call from Roberta Kaplan, who is a nationally recognized civil rights attorney. You might see her in the news today because she represents E. Jean Carroll, who just had a big win in her case related to the president. But Robbie also represented Edie Windsor in the marriage equality case before the Supreme Court in 2013 that struck down the Defense of Marriage Act. When Robbie, who I had gotten to know through my work in the Attorney General's office, we were getting Attorney General Barbara Underwood confirmed in early 2018. When Robbie reached out and said, "Hey, would you be interested in helping me sue Nazis?" There was no other answer I could give than yes. It is just such a natural thing for me to be doing right now, given my family background. And I wish it weren't necessary. I think if you had asked my grandparents or my mom or myself, or frankly, probably any of us, if this was something that would be necessary in America in the year 2020, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, we probably all would have thought you were crazy. But this is the reality of the world we're living in, with emboldened neo-Nazis feeling so powerful and able to go out there and wreak violence, walk into a synagogue with a semi-automatic weapon, and spread the sort of hate and destruction that has become, frankly, commonplace over the last few years. And so if we have to be doing this, I feel particularly lucky to get to do it. I wish we didn't, but it is the reality of our world right now. And I do feel a level of gratitude to get to fight back through our justice system and through the work that we do at IFA.
Thank you so much. That really resonates with me. I think about that often in the work that I do at HIAS. You know, I greatly wish that we could be out of business, but given that we are not, given that there is a global refugee crisis, as the granddaughter and great-granddaughter of refugees, I feel so lucky to be able to do this work. I really also appreciated what you mentioned about the idea that so many of us are raised with kind of an idea of what happened historically in our families, but that in a way, for so many of us, it's felt very amorphous until the last couple of years, that it really did feel like something abstract and also something that wouldn't happen again, right? Something very much situated in the past. And now we know that it's not. So I want to take us out of the personal a little bit into kind of the nitty gritty of the issues that we're talking about. And we've started to throw around a couple of terms. So sort of at the top here, I want us to define some of those terms. You know, you mentioned neo-Nazi, we've talked about white extremism or violent extremism, white nationalism, white supremacy, sort of all these different terms floating around. There are connections between them, but they also function really differently. So I am curious if you'd be willing to share with us kind of defining our terms here. What are the differences between these terms? How do they work together? What are we talking about when we talk about white supremacy, white nationalism, extremism?
That's a great question. And I think it's one that many people have. And frankly, particularly right now, those terms are used fairly interchangeably by the media, even by us at times, just because in some cases they are interchangeable, but in some other cases they're not. So some, I guess, baseline definitions that we could use to inform our conversation. But again, these are really moving targets in a lot of ways for many people. And however you ask might have a different definition themselves. White supremacy, I consider to be sort of the system of power that has not just resulted in the violence we're now seeing on our streets, in our synagogues, in our communities, but also is really embedded in the power structure of this country, everything from our justice system to our electoral politics system to the fundamental racism and white supremacy that is inherent in so much of what people of color experience on a day-to-day basis, and the privilege that white people have as a result. White nationalism in many ways emerged directly from white supremacy. It's sort of like a descendant of white supremacy, if you will, or I like to think of it as sort of the movement that has come out of this system of white supremacy. White nationalism is an ideology that essentially argues there should be a white ethno-state or something along those lines, that white people who these white nationalists believe to be superior, as these systems of white supremacy have reinforced for decades, should have a state that is their own, that does not welcome people of color, Jews, LGBTQ individuals in many cases, and a number of other people who don't meet their very narrow and vile definition for what this country should be. There are many, many different forms of white supremacy and white nationalism at play right now. And it's also important to understand that increasingly we're seeing other forms of far-right extremism that in certain ways are like Venn diagrams, that many different circles that overlap in different ways. So you might have heard, for example, the term Boogaloo extremists, who were the ones who, this is the newer movement that has been directly linked to a number of instances of violence, even some murders of law enforcement, the kidnapping plot against the Michigan governor, and others in recent months. Many have shown up at Black Lives Matter protests with the intent to incite violence. They are an anti-government, pro-gun movement. Many of them are white supremacists. Some say that they aren't white supremacists. Of course, the same thing goes for militia members, these private militias, like the Oath Keepers and others who have cropped up in recent years, seemingly to, protect against government overreach and defend the Second Amendment in their view, but in many cases to really intimidate and wreak violence in communities across this country when there are those that they disagree with. And so it's important to understand that this isn't a monolithic movement. We oftentimes at J Street talk about how the Jewish community isn't a monolithic movement. The far-right extremism that we're seeing right now is incredibly diverse in a variety of ways, but there are many overlapping tactics, tools, and ideologies that we see, with white supremacy being a centerpiece of many of these groups and individuals, and also the same sorts of tools and tactics that we've seen in recent months and years, many of which, I should note, really were previewed at Charlottesville. Charlottesville in so many ways was meant to be this massive coming together. It was called Unite the Right for a reason, that brought together the various disparate factions and groups within the white supremacist and far-right extremist movement. And the tools, the tactics, the use of social media to plan the violence, car attacks, which have seen a horrific rise in recent months, the use of disinformation and terror tactics online to instill fear and intimidation. These are all things that we have seen over and over again over the last 3 years, And so as we continue our conversation and as we think about what happened in Pittsburgh, what happened in Charlottesville, and the many other instances of violence in recent years, it's so important to understand the ways in which these earlier attacks served as a harbinger, as a preview of the cycle of violence.
Thank you so much. I found that incredibly helpful, really trying to think about the ways in which systems interact with movements and kind of give birth to each other in weird ways and interconnect. And I think it's also really important for us to remember that that there is diversity on that right end of the spectrum, and to understand all the insidious ways in which white supremacy and white nationalism function. And you started to talk a little bit about how it both sort of undergirds our political system and also how this is a unique moment. So I'm curious for you to share a little bit about how this sort of general increase in the public domain of really xenophobic rhetoric, right? Anti-Black racism, anti-Semitism, anti-immigrant sentiment, homophobia, all of these hatreds, how is this sort of public rhetoric connected to a political embrace of this language? So how are we seeing that flow into the political sphere, and really the active divestment also from programs that are intended to fight this kind of rhetoric at the federal level? How is that playing out right now?
I think it's easy to be so overwhelmed by everything that's happened over the last 4 years in our country, from the Muslim ban, which was nearly 4 years ago, or at least the first iteration of it, to what we're seeing now. But all of it is so deeply interconnected, to the point you're making. The xenophobic and white nationalist policies that have come out of the White House and from the highest levels of power in Washington, from including the Muslim ban, but many other anti-immigrant and xenophobic policies, are directly connected to the same sort of violent white supremacy and white nationalism that we've seen play out in our communities, including most notably in Pittsburgh 2 years ago. And so in some ways, I would look at the violence as sort of the tip of the iceberg of much larger white nationalist and white supremacist action that has really grown over the last few years. And I think one of the best ways to understand this is to actually look at the conspiracy theories that fuel the violence, and that also tend to fuel a lot of the far right, whether they're violent or not, in this space. And most notably something known as the Great Replacement, or replacement theory, which is the idea that Jews are the puppet masters who have effectively orchestrated the replacement of the white race by supporting the Black community, the immigrant and refugee community, the Muslim community, the Latinx community, and any other community that, again, doesn't meet their narrow and vile definition of what this country should be. It's what they mean when they chant things like "Jews will not replace us." And we see this ideology at play over and over again. We, of course, saw it in Charlottesville. We saw it in Pittsburgh, where Robert Bowers, the shooter, directly espoused this conspiracy theory in much of his writing. And on social media, we saw it in Christchurch, New Zealand, which happened a few months after the Pittsburgh attack, where the shooter there killed dozens of Muslims praying in mosque. And it was that attack and the ideology of that shooter that in turn inspired Poway and El Paso, where the same replacement theory was at play. And it's so easy to see it when it's an extremist with a machine gun walking into a synagogue or a mosque or a Walmart. And we get it so clearly in those moments. It's hard to ignore the heinous nature of this conspiracy theory when it literally is thrown in our face that way. But it's also important to understand just how deeply embedded it is in the broader right-wing talking points we hear that reflect that we hear from the highest levels of power in our government, from the White House to members of Congress down to the state and local level. And I think one of the best examples of this is this idea of the caravan, which is what really fueled the Pittsburgh attack and is probably a perfect encapsulation of how this replacement theory conspiracy works. For weeks leading up to the Pittsburgh attack, we heard a number of far-right politicians beating the drum on the fact that a caravan was coming up through Mexico from Honduras to replace white people in our country. And over again, we heard how George Soros was behind it, which is perhaps the most common of anti-Semitic tropes that fuel this conspiracy theory that Jews are the puppet masters. And it was that very same conspiracy theory that the Pittsburgh shooter then cited that before he went in and killed 11 at Tree of Life. And that in so many ways reflects how talking points from politicians, from far-right media, and from others can quickly turn into real-world violence by these white supremacists and other extremists who are just looking for the excuse. And he chose, as you mentioned earlier, that specific congregation or that specific synagogue and the congregations that were there because of their deep connections to HIAS and to their work on refugees and immigrant support. And I mean, in some ways, you couldn't make it up if you tried, just how perfectly what happened 2 years ago encapsulated the ways in which these conspiracies and this hateful rhetoric can turn into real world violence, fueled by these sorts of conspiracies and driven by the same sorts of age-old anti-Semitic tropes that we have all seen for generation after generation, and in their current iteration, really have the benefit of both fueling anti-Semitism, which is at the core of this ideology, but of course perpetuating the racism, xenophobia, misogyny, and other forms of hate that are part of this broader white nationalist and white supremacist ideology.
I think that is such an important point about the interconnections between these hatreds. And I think, on the one hand, like you said, we're definitely seeing the way in which popular rhetoric can become political rhetoric. And then that political rhetoric sort of feeds back in and fuels popular violence, popular hatred. I think, another sort of, or the same side from a slightly different angle of that coin is the idea also that we've seen white nationalists and white supremacists really pit different marginalized groups against one another, right? So to use, for instance, white or white passing Jews as a sort of wedge in fighting anti-Black racist violence. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about, what are some of these connections that we do see between anti-Semitism, anti-Black racism, anti-immigrant sentiment, and when at the same time that we want to see the connections between them and how they function in the same space, how can we also honor the differences, right? To not sort of lump marginalized groups together and to really understand how white supremacy and white nationalism gets weaponized in different ways against different marginalized groups.
Yeah, there's so much to say about this. And I feel like, there's just the ways in which our fates are so deeply interconnected now, despite attempts to make it seem like they're not, is critical. Because at the end of the day, these white supremacists and the people who enable them in our political system want to tear communities apart because it only serves their interests if we are not united in pursuit of our shared, generally progressive vision for what this country should be, a welcoming place that embraces immigrants and refugees and the diversity of our communities. And so it's of course in their interest, it's a no-brainer, it's of course in their interest to try to tear communities apart. But at the end of the day, it's so critical to understand how all of these forms of hate, everyone who is on this call, everyone who doesn't fit, again, that narrow definition of what they believe this white ethno-state should be, is inherently tied to the hate that we're talking about here. None of us would be welcome in their vision for this white ethno-state. And so understanding, I think, the centrality of anti-Semitism to how this hate and ideology works also allows us to understand how it's used to fuel the racism and xenophobia and other forms of hate that we're talking about. And to sort of expand on what we talked about earlier, many of these extremists believe that nothing that has happened over the last few decades rather, in terms of from the civil rights movement through the feminist movement and many of the LGBTQ movement, and many of the other movements that have resulted in increased power and rights and stature for minority communities. They believe none of that could have happened on its own because they have such a low opinion, if you will, of these various communities, whether it be women or Black people or any of these other entities. And the idea there is that there had to have been some sort of puppet master pulling the strings. How else could these inferior people have sort of garnered the power and the rights that they have over the last few decades? And so it's so important to understand how anti-Semitism is central to these forms of hate and how all of our faiths are so deeply intertwined. Because you can't take on anti-Semitism without taking on the racism, the xenophobia, the misogyny, the other forms of hate that it's fueled. And you can't take on those forms of hate without taking on the anti-Semitism that's really at its core. All that being said, it's also important to understand the way that, because of the white supremacist power structures that exist in this country, that me as a white presenting Jew, has infinite privilege that many of the other communities don't. And while I'm out there proudly as a Jewish American woman, and the neo-Nazi defendants in our suit want to make sure that all of their comrades know that, we also have privileges that some of these other communities don't. And so there's a push and a pull there, where we as Jews, I think, have a specific obligation to take on the white nationalist movement, the systems of white supremacy, and so much else of what we're talking about because of the privilege that we might have. But it's also incumbent on all of us to understand how deeply connected these forms of hate are, and that for other communities, as we are working with them to take on racism and xenophobia, to understand the centrality of anti-Semitism to this white nationalism and white supremacy. Because again, you can't take on one without the other, and our fates are so deeply connected here, which is not a new idea. Pretty sure there's a poem written about that a few decades back, and it's critical that we understand that despite efforts, whether it be disinformation campaigns online, fake social media accounts posing as racist Jewish Americans, or the efforts to sort of highlight anti-Semitism in the Black community. These are only efforts to tear communities apart when the vast majority of Jewish Americans, Black Americans, and many others understand how our fates are so deeply intertwined here. So we can't fall victim to those campaigns. That is what the white supremacists want. That's what these far-right leaders want. And we can't let them have it.
Thank you so much. I feel like the most important thing that each of us can do right now is to really assess what are the layers of privilege that we have, but how can we not let those layers of privilege divide us from people who our fates are so much bound up with, and how can we be united together in a movement for justice? It just feels like incredibly important in this moment, which is a moment of just rife with division in our country, and not becoming divided from people who are our allies, and engaging in difficult conversations to understand one another's histories feels like really an act of justice that we can do in this world right now. I'm curious, the FBI sees violent white supremacy as one of the most urgent forms of what they call domestic terrorism, what I would just call terrorism. And I'm curious why we hear so little about it. Why don't we hear more about the governmental efforts to fight white supremacy and white nationalism, and why is so little being done to address it?
Yeah, I think, there's really been a fascinating and horrifying dynamic that's come to light over the last few months in particular, in which you see the experts in our federal government, whether it be senior leadership of the FBI or the sort of career apolitical people working at the Department of Homeland Security or elsewhere, making crystal clear that white supremacist terror is the gravest threat to our country right now. In fact, the Department of Homeland Security just published a few weeks ago a report that said white supremacist terror is the, quote, most persistent and lethal threat to our country. This was a report that the Trump administration tried to bury for months, and the whistleblower came out a few months back to say as much, and it finally saw the light of day a few weeks ago rather. And at the same time, senior people at the FBI, including even Director Wray, have been highlighting the same concern. But all of this is happening as Trump and Barr and other senior administration officials continue to try to distract and deflect by pointing the fingers at Antifa and Black Lives Matter and other progressively minded movements, which again is nothing more than an attempt to distract. We know, there's no two ways about it. The facts are so crystal clear right now. Some of them were mentioned earlier, but we know, for example, 2019 saw the highest levels of domestic terror, which is, how it's referred to, even if it should just be referred to as terror. I agree with you on that. But 2019 saw the highest levels of domestic terror than any year since 1995, which was the year of the Oklahoma City bombing. And report after report, not just from progressively minded institutions, but from centrist and federal government institutions, highlight how white supremacist and other far-right extremist violence makes up nearly all of that extremism, of that domestic terror. We also was also mentioned earlier how, for example, anti-Semitism has hit record levels. The ADL reported that in 2019, there were more anti-Semitic incidents on record than any year before that they've been tracking. None of this is a coincidence, and none of it is happening in silos. And so at a time when the federal government, and specifically the president and the attorney general, are trying to distract and deflect by pointing fingers at, for example, Antifa, which, by the way, is the same thing our Charlottesville defendants do when in an attempt to avoid accountability for the violence they brought to Charlottesville, it's really important to look to the experts and the facts and make crystal clear all of it, what they actually are and how dire this threat is. All of this is compounded by efforts by the federal government to disinvest from the sorts of programs and work that is critical to countering extremism. Most notably, the Department of Justice civil rights investigations and prosecutions are down nearly 2/3 from the end of the Obama administration. Where they are taking on cases, it tends to be things like taking on affirmative action at Harvard, as opposed to actual civil rights work. In a different era, I suspect DOJ might take on a conspiracy case along the lines of the ones my organization has with regards to what happened in Charlottesville. And of course, other programs and funding have been cut as well, from the Department of Homeland Security's Domestic Terror Intelligence Unit to counter extremism programming and a variety of other programs and work that is central to combating extremism, particularly at a time when it's hitting record levels. And so it's not just that the federal government is enabling these extremists with the nods and winks and increasingly explicit support they've gotten from the president and others, but also the federal government is actively disinvesting from any effort to combat it. And so it makes private plaintiffs like ours in our Charlottesville case and private citizens all the more critical at a moment like this.
So let's talk a little bit more about that case. I would love for you to share with all of us a little bit more about the work that Integrity First for America is really doing to change that, to make sure that folks, the organizers of the Charlottesville protests and rallies, are held accountable. So tell us a little bit about the background of the case, what you're doing right now. And maybe you started to talk about this a little bit earlier, but if you want to talk just a little bit about the connection between, subsequent cycles of violence and Charlottesville, we would be excited to hear a little bit more about that.
Absolutely. And I think it's worth stepping back and remembering what actually happened in Charlottesville, because again, it really served as a preview, as a harbinger of the cycle of violence that followed, not just the connections that I'll dive into in a moment, as you suggested, but also the tools, the tactics, as I mentioned earlier. And so it's easy to forget 3 years ago in an American city, first neo-Nazis wearing matching uniforms, carrying those tiki torches, which, as I mentioned, were really meant to evoke the KKK and the Nazis, marched on the University of Virginia, chanting things like "Jews will not replace us," "blood and soil." They ultimately surrounded a small group of peaceful counter-protesters, largely University of Virginia students and community members. They threw fuel, lit torches, kicked them, punched them, beat them up. One of our plaintiffs who was there that evening, an African-American undergrad at UVA, said he thought he was going to die. Nearby an interfaith gathering that had been organized to give people a safe place to come to, knowing that white supremacists were descending on their town, had to ironically shelter in place because of how unsafe it was outside. Many of our plaintiffs were there that evening and were injured in that violence. But of course, the next day, Saturday, August 12th, we know how the day ultimately culminated, but it's important to understand that it was really a day of violence. One of the details that sticks with me most is what happened to the local synagogue in Charlottesville, which was surrounded that morning. It was a Saturday morning. They were observing Shabbat, surrounded by neo-Nazis with semi-automatic weapons, chanting things like Sieg Heil, talking in their online forums about, quote, torching those Jewish monsters. And the detail that is seared in my mind is how the synagogue, which was home to a Torah scroll that had been saved from Nazi Germany, of course, had to evacuate congregants and Torah scrolls out the back. But the idea that this Torah scroll that was under Nazi threat decades ago was again under Nazi threat in America in 2017 put such a fine point on the horror of this. And again, the targeting of the synagogue is sadly something that we saw play out a year later in Pittsburgh and a few months after that in Poway. These are not accidents. The day continued. One of our plaintiffs, Reverend Seth Wispelway, marched with a number of interfaith clergy members and were violently attacked. And of course, it culminated in James Fields driving his car into a crowd of peaceful counter-protesters, killing Heather Heyer, injuring many of our other plaintiffs. A number of our plaintiffs you can see in that iconic photo of the car going through the crowd, including Marcus Martin, who's the African-American man splayed across the back, Natalie Romero, whose skull was fractured in the attack, and many others. And what's so critical to know is that nothing that happened was an accident, but rather it was the result of meticulous planning for months in advance in online forums. And the role of social media is something we've both, I think, alluded to a number of times, and it's certainly key to understanding how these extremists operate. But in these social media forums, most notably on a platform called Discord, which is typically used by video gamers to communicate when they are playing a game, there were all these different channels dedicated to everything from the mundane, what to wear, what to bring for lunch, what's the best way to sew a swastika onto a flag. I mean, when Hannah Arendt talked about the banality of evil, this was it. But also, it really was horrific, where they talked about how to use free speech instruments, quote unquote, like flagpoles as weapons, and how to make it look like self-defense. And they even talked about whether they could hit protesters with cars and then claim self-defense. That conversation was had in July of 2017, a month before James Fields drove his car into that crowd of peaceful counter-protesters, resulting in Heather Heyer's death and extensive injury. And so on behalf of 9 community members who were injured in that violence, we are taking to court the 24 individuals and groups that were specifically responsible for conspiring to orchestrate that violence. There were hundreds of extremists in Charlottesville. They should all be held accountable in different ways if they broke the law. What our suit specifically does is take on the leaders of this movement, who were directly responsible for orchestrating what happened through those chats, through other communications, through the organizations that they run. It is the only legal effort in the country to take on this broad leadership of this violent movement. And as you mentioned earlier, it's so important, not just because of the accountability we're seeking for our plaintiffs and the justice that the Charlottesville community deserves, but also because these are the leaders and groups that are directly connected to the broader cycle of violence we've seen in recent years. Most notably, some of the Charlottesville leaders communicated with Robert Bowers, the Pittsburgh shooter, on Gab, which is another far-right hate site, in the days leading up to his attack. The Christchurch shooter painted onto his gun a white power symbol that was first popularized by one of our defendants. And I've talked already about how those attacks have in turn inspired Poway and El Paso. And even now, during both the COVID pandemic and the Black Lives Matter protests, we've seen over and over again the centrality of our defendants to this movement, whether it be a member of National Socialist Movement, which is, I think, the country's largest neo-Nazi hate group. That's one of our defendants that tried to bomb a hospital in Missouri during the beginning of the pandemic, to efforts to spread disinformation and violence during the Black Lives Matter protests, like a fake Antifa tweet that was actually written by Identity Europa, another one of our defendants, to the rise of car attacks that have directly mimicked what happened in Charlottesville 3 years ago, to even now defendants like Andrew Anglin, who runs the Daily Stormer, the leading hate site in the country and I think in the world, again, another one of our defendants, who posted the day after the first debate that the president's standby comments were a call for a race war, and he was inspired to go out and support that call. And so we see the centrality of these defendants to the broader movement, and our theory of change here is that by taking them on through a civil lawsuit like ours, we can not only hold them accountable, because that accountability has been so sorely lacking in the aftermath of Charlottesville for the reasons we discussed earlier, but we can also bankrupt and dismantle them through large civil judgments. We've already seen this firsthand with defendants like Richard Spencer complaining that the case is financially crippling, and others whining about how they can't open a new headquarters, a few being actually thrown in jail or facing tens of thousands of dollars in sanctions for their contempt of court or otherwise flouting court orders in our case. And so by taking them on through our justice system, through a civil suit like this, we can effectively bankrupt and dismantle them. We're already seeing those impacts when we win large judgments at trial, which is currently scheduled for April. That impact will be infinitely greater. There's also, I think, and this is worth noting, the importance of our justice system and of trials like this to the public understanding of an issue. And this is something that goes back to the Scopes Monkey trial through some of the Prop 8 marriage equality case in California last decade, and many others in between. The importance of a trial like this to making clear the seriousness of this issue, how these extremists operate, and just how dire this threat is. And most importantly, that there will be very real financial and legal consequences for this behavior. And so there's so much to say about the case's impact. I'll leave it there.
That's actually a perfect transition. We're going to move into our questions. We've gotten a lot of questions from participants, so I want to make sure we have time to answer some of them. And the first one is that Gail actually would like you to reflect a little bit on the reaction to the lawsuit from people in Charlottesville. So how did the community in Charlottesville react to the case?
Well, the lawsuit really came from the community of Charlottesville. Our plaintiffs are 9 Charlottesville community members who represent the incredible diversity of the city. Some are University of Virginia students, a few were law students or undergrads. Some are clergy, like Reverend Seth Wispelway, one of our plaintiffs. Many are young professionals or others who are deeply tied to the community. Many had lived there, in some cases, their whole lives. And so this is a case that came out of the Charlottesville community by a diverse coalition of those impacted by the violence. And it's not an accident that Charlottesville was chosen as well. You know, these extremists went to Charlottesville under the guise of protesting the removal of the Confederate Robert E. Lee statue. But Charlottesville was chosen because it is an incredibly progressive, diverse community with a large African-American population, a Jewish population, and many other diverse communities. And so the fact that our plaintiffs represent the diversity of that community in every sense of the word is something that the defendants aren't so thrilled about, much like they're not so thrilled about the fact that this is an effort led by Jewish women. But also, I think, you know, indicative of why Charlottesville was chosen in the first place. And so it's been heartening to see the support our plaintiffs have gotten from their neighbors and colleagues, and not, and again, in Charlottesville and across Virginia, but also across the country. And I think, you know, if there's ever a silver lining at a moment like this, it's both, I think, the bravery of our plaintiffs first in coming forward to do this and channeling what happened to them into something that will have a meaningful impact for their community and for this country, but also the response that they've gotten, not just from their community, but this broader country, whether it be people who chip in $10 to support their case, to, you know, people across the country reaching out to see how else they could help, whether it be through programs like this or otherwise engaging. And so that has been heartening to see, of course, from the Charlottesville community, but also from across the country, seeing how deeply interconnected these acts of violence are, and how what happened in Charlottesville really spurred a lot of what followed.
Thank you. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit. Fran has a very tachlis question, very practical question, and is wondering if you could give us some numbers in terms of how many people actually belong, sort of on the other side of things, to the white nationalist groups, and also who funds these movements.
Those are good questions. Both are very hard to answer, unfortunately. I think what we know is that while they might be loud and they might have made themselves known, there are so many more of us than there are of them. This is not a movement that has massive people power in the way that our side might have. I think there are far many more Americans who abhor violence, who believe in the diversity of our communities, who reject the hate that has become so central to our discourse right now. And while we can't, it's hard to quantify, there are, of course, hate groups like some of the ones we're taking on that have semi-formal memberships. Although if you ask any of them at any given time, you know, they won't give you a straight answer on what their membership is. In fact, I remember one of our defendants talking about how he just didn't know offhand how many neo-Nazi members of National Socialist Movement, the group he ran, had. It's a real threat, not like, make no mistake, but there are so many more of us than there are of them. And so as frustrating and daunting as it might be at times when you see these groups and these individuals rearing their ugly heads and spreading this violence, it's important to have that perspective.
Absolutely. I think that's actually a great transition into our last question. I'm going to kind of combine three questions that we got that all really hinge on the idea of, so what now? How can, my question for you is, what opportunities are there for members specifically of the Jewish community to come together to combat all of this? Some of the pieces that some of our participants pulled out specifically were, when we look at hateful rhetoric being reinforced on social media and hateful radio stations. Is there anything we could do to combat that? How do we hold the federal government accountable for white supremacy in the same way as this case in other ways? And, of course, there's also this huge national divide between those who support immigrants and refugees and those who don't. So perhaps how can we bridge that gap a little bit? So I guess our final question is, what next? What can all of us do to support the work that you're doing?
Again, there's so much to say on this, so I'll try to be succinct and give you sort of the top lines. But I think it's worth stepping back for a second, because it's so easy to feel hopeless and helpless and daunted and scared in this moment. I know I do at times, and particularly if you are sort of doom scrolling on social media, like we're all guilty of before we go to bed each night. It's particularly easy to feel that way. And I think again often about my grandparents' generation and my grandparents' experience. But I also remember that there is a clear difference between their generation and ours, which is that, as tenuous as it might be at times, we live in a country that is built on the rule of law, that has a justice system, that has laws like the ones we're using in our case. And for as long as we have them, we're going to defend them and we're going to use them. And all of us have the ability to do that in whatever form it takes, whether it be through supporting our plaintiffs in this case, through advocacy work, and the broader fight against white nationalism and white supremacy and xenophobia, and through generally holding those accountable who enable and empower these extremists. And so most specifically, if you're interested in supporting our plaintiffs, you can get involved through Integrity First for America. The website is in the chat, and I believe it'll be sent out to you after this event. Everything we do directly supports this case and our plaintiffs right now. It's the only case we are taking on because it's just too important, too robust to do otherwise. So sign up for our updates on our website so that you can follow the cases we prepare for trial this spring. If you're able to donate, every dollar we raise directly goes to the case, and spread the word. Let people know that there is a critical, tangible way that they could actually fight back against violent extremism right now, not in the streets, but in our courts, where we have the power to do something about this. But also, there's so much more that can be done. There are pieces of legislation that have in many cases languished in Congress and elsewhere, from the No Hate Act to the Domestic Terror Prevention Act, which would just do the most bare minimum things that you would think our government was already doing when it comes to coordination and putting resources behind the fight against extremism. Domestic Terror Prevention Act, I believe, passed the House a few months ago. Of course, it was killed in the Senate. Looking into 2021, I'm hoping that will pass and that we will have someone at the highest levels of our government who will make this a priority. But don't let this fall off the radar screens of your elected officials, be it federal, state, or local. On the local and state level in particular, putting on my former AG hat, there is so much that can be done, particularly when there's a vacuum when it comes to the federal government. Making sure your local governments and law enforcement are enforcing hate crimes laws, making sure that you're creating safe, welcoming communities. So hold your officials accountable, not just on the federal level, but across the board. And also hold the private sector accountable. We've talked a number of times about the role of social media here. It is impossible to understand the rise of extremism in this country without understanding the role of social media. And in so many ways, social media has become really the condemn of the 21st century, a place where these extremists can gather and connect, not just in the woods in their white hoods like they did a century ago, but online with broad reach that results in violence like Charlottesville and Pittsburgh and so many other instances. No social media company is under any obligation to give a platform to extremists. That's not what the First Amendment says. That's not what the law says. They have every right to ban hate and violence and bigotry from their platforms, but in many cases are just not willing to do so because they don't want to bear the political brunt of that and lose the traffic. Hold these social media companies accountable. There are fantastic campaigns like the Stop Hate for Profit campaign that a number of organizations are involved in, like Color of Change and ADL and Sleeping Giants and many others. Make sure that you are calling it out when you see it, report it. If you see something on social media, there are some companies that are at least trying to start to do the right thing. Others, like Facebook, for example, have a very long way to go. But make sure that you are using your voice, not just when it comes to your elected officials, but to the private sector as well. There's, again, so much more to say here, but I think I will leave it there and just say how grateful I am to have spent an hour with all of you today and see the work that we're doing is so deeply connected to the work that J Street does in fighting for the values and for I think the progressive vision that is so central to what the Jewish community is all about. And so for me, it is just such a pleasure and an honor to get to spend part of today with all of you. And particularly grateful to you, Rachel, and to Christine and the J Street team for making it happen.
Thank you so much, Amy. We're going to close out our call in just a minute, but I want to just give us one thought to part with, which is that so often it is said that the antidote to hate is love. But I actually want to offer that I think the antidote to hate is actually justice. And what we have to remember, though, is that justice is what love looks like in public. And so when we really take action, when we join our voices together with those who stand against hatred, we express our love in the form of justice, and that's how we combat hate. So I hope that we'll all find a way to do that, particularly in the next 7 days, use our voices, use our votes, and our platform. So I echo Amy's thanks to all of you for joining us today. And thank you to J Street for having us.
Thank you. I'd like to extend J Street's thanks to both of you. I would like you to make some bumper stickers, Rabbi, with that on it. I would put that on my car. It is a great sentiment. And thank all of you for joining today. We have another J Stream tomorrow on Rabin's legacy 25 years after. So if you have not registered for that J Stream, we will also be talking about the rise of the right in a very different way. Please feel free to join us. But again, thank you, Rabbi Rachel Grant Meyer and Amy Spitalnick, Integrity First for America and HIAS. This was a wonderful way to be motivated 7 days out for the election. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much.